You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Welcome back to The Sacred Sofa, listeners, and good to connect with you again, Brad, as we welcome back our special guest and friend, Karla, to the podcast to introduce two topics and two episodes on hospitality and hostility. So that's where we're going in our episode today to talk about hostility. Welcome, Karla.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Karla, great to have you with us again. Good to see you as always, Grace. We're gonna save hospitality for next week. So let's start with the basics here, Karla. What do we mean by hostility in this context? It's a strong, kind of stirring word. So tell us a little bit about what we should be thinking about with hostility.
Yeah, it really is a strong word, at least for most of us when it comes to our daily experience. I'm using a framework from Henri Nouwen, and I've noticed that with him, he really gets to the heart of things, stuff you find when you get right down deep to the root. So he tends to use really strong words. Hostility may not likely be on our radar much of the time. So when I say hostility, it's used as a catch-all. So it's not necessarily like outward aggression, but more a kind of closed offness, defensiveness towards others, kind of our armor in all its degrees. And I'm talking about a fear-based reaction that's just our best attempt to protect ourselves.
I like that defining definition and perspective you're starting with, Karla. And I would agree from a therapeutic perspective, all behavior is on a spectrum. So hostility can manifest itself in many ways, such as, like you said, guardedness, cynicism, sarcasm, mistrust, can be frustration, impatience, stubbornness. I mean, self-righteousness is in there, gossip, criticalness, judgmentalism, and it's often rooted in past experiences of hurt or betrayal, leading us to put up walls to protect ourselves.
Yeah, walls. I like that because, well, people can be disappointing. People are often hurtful. So, why wouldn't we protect ourselves?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, defenses are reasonable, right? And yet, depending on our upbringing and how we were socialized, also how we're wired, some of us may actually struggle to identify hostility in ourselves. And then when we do notice it, we may feel guilty. So we shove it down, reject, or shame ourselves because we're supposed to be loving, right? Especially as Jesus path people. And somebody asked me just recently if it's normal to hate someone the first time you meet them. And, they were talking about those times when people rub us the wrong way. We just instantly have our back up, right? So when that happens, which I think it happens to all of us, if we get bogged down in shaming ourselves for reacting so strongly, we might miss the important cues that we actually need to pay attention to. Maybe this person is actually dangerous, or maybe they're just annoying. And it might be us that has some biases, some discrimination issues to attend to.
I love that you identified that because this experience happens a lot to me, Karla. I don't know about hate, but I strongly, some people just by looking at them. And so that's helpful to normalize it for me. But I'm wondering here, it's interesting to get in touch with our hostile side, but that feels a bit loaded to me, that word. And, after you gave a sermon on hostility, somebody had mentioned in our question period, if maybe assertive might be a gentle way to sort of talk about hostility. Can you speak to that? Like, is that a good way to frame things, maybe?
Oh, it's such a great word to add to the mix. I think it'll be really helpful for us as we keep that in mind as we make room for our strength. If we are hesitant to assert ourselves, it can be really easy to let the fear of coming across as rude or unkind actually keep us from standing up and saying no way when we need to. But that's a really important capacity to develop, especially when it's motivated by love and honoring the image of God in ourselves and others.
I like the distinction you're having about our communication, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to quickly go back briefly in towards this, meeting someone for the first time and maybe experiencing hostility, anxiety. I've said many times anxiety is a messenger, and I just want to make sure we're careful that we trust that because instinct is important. And so there's a message here, and sometimes we want to stay in that space and kind of ruminate in our heads. Well, maybe I'm being like trusted initially, and then it's okay to come back and review it,
Right.
because we don't want to shove down our instinct to the point that we've left ourselves in a potentially dangerous situation. We do want to honor that instinct and then step back. When we're safe, we can re-examine and reintroduce another experience. Does that make sense what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I really appreciate that.
But in terms of communicating, there are three primary communication styles: passive, aggressive, and assertive. And some folks can make the mistake of thinking that being assertive means you're being aggressive.
Yeah.
Some folks will even accuse you of being aggressive when you're actually being assertive, which is a boundary jumper tactic, by the way. So I'm sure we'll get to that another time. But assertive is simply being clear about your thoughts, feelings, opinions, and your boundaries. And I do agree that hostility and anger may be an indicator that a need is being unmet or that the boundary has been crossed. Assertiveness is a really strong communication tool to indicate a boundary that people may not be aware of. And I know, Karla, you shared a bit of story about that. I think this would be a great illustration that you could share with us listeners as well.
Well, I tend to struggle with boundaries and with being assertive. I'm afraid to come across as aggressive. All kinds of good reasons for that. But I've noticed it's easier when I'm acting on behalf of someone else. So I'm starting there and working on applying it to myself as well. But I did have this example shortly after our daughter was bitten by a dog, and she had to have vials and vials of rabies shots. So we'd go for walks. My guard was up. I didn't want her to get bitten again. I didn't want her to be stressed or to have a lasting fear of dogs. So one time, as an off-leash dog bounded towards us, I just yelled at the owner, "This is not okay." But she had no idea what I was talking about, so it was pretty ineffective. And then another time, I threw my body between the dog and my daughter and just yelled, "Not today." Again. Yeah, just weird, confusing. So I'm just finding that if assertiveness is new to us, it may not be very tidy as we try it out, but I believe we can learn.
I love those illustrations and your vulnerability, Karla, in telling these stories. But, it may have sounded aggressive, but you were asserting a boundary between your safety and your child's safety and this person who was unaware that they needed to, although I think dog owners know dogs aren't supposed to be off leash.
Right.
We should do a whole episode on dog people because I am a dog person now, but I share the frustrations you have with them off leash and whatnot. I'm wondering though, Karla and Grace here, how do you see the balance between healthy boundaries? And I know we're going to get into the call to hospitality next week in our daily lives. But one of the things I think I always fear when I hear talk about boundaries and walls is that for someone like me, who's always looking for an excuse, how do I avoid sort of using boundaries as an excuse to not participate in maybe some of the more difficult things of the Jesus path?
Brad, I love your vulnerability as well. You just keep it real. You just keep it real. But I think it'd be important, Karla, maybe you can share with us what you see as the differences between walls and boundaries. And then also, how can boundaries be a part of the Jesus path?
Yeah, well, something that they share in common, and I think it's important to notice, is that they both spring from a deep human desire to feel safe, secure, and respected. These are just fundamental human needs. And it's how we meet these needs where the difference comes in. So boundaries are intentional and they're flexible. And they're put in place for the good of both people in the relationship. So they're all about a kind of negotiation. So they're finding the distance at which I'm able to freely and authentically love and be with someone else. And then walls they're just simpler, easier maybe. They're a solid one-size-fits-all solution. And it really is about avoiding emotional intimacy, about avoiding vulnerability at all costs. So walls are what we make when we use hostility to keep us safe. And just as an example, we were just discussing this and someone gave me this great example of the difference. So say you have someone in your life who regularly calls you in the evening to talk, but you're too tired to get into the topics they're always wanting to discuss. So a wall, if you put that up, it would be just avoiding them because you're resenting them, you're feeling trapped. You can't keep having these phone calls like this, but you also can't bring yourself to explain your needs. That's a wall. A boundary would be having that tricky conversation where you actually explain that the late hour, these conversation topics are just too much for me right now. So boundaries are about maintaining the relationship on certain terms that works for both people. It's a negotiation. And that takes uncomfortable conversations sometimes. Walls are easier, but they tend to end things.
I love that.
Yeah, I like that distinction because it's making me realize I'm more of a wall person. I'd rather just not answer that phone call than maybe have that difficult conversation, right? That's
So
good.
hard.
That's really helpful for me to think in terms of that. Now, you talked about the psychological and social explanations for, why we experience hostility. I'm curious how, from a theological lens, how do you see this aligning or differing from maybe some of the ways that scripture speaks to human nature, even sin?
Yeah. Well, so the Bible explains our hostility using the story of the fall in Genesis, when Adam and Eve disobey God by eating the fruit, and then they can no longer remain in the Garden of Eden. So scholar and theologian Scott McKnight describes that that humans after that moment, after the fall, we can call us cracked icons. So icons means image or likeness of God. We still bear the divine image. We still icon God, but that image is imperfect. It's distorted somehow. So we're at odds with God, ourselves, one another, and with the world. And because that oneness that used to be there is cracked, instead of loving one another, we now desire to climb over each other in order to control and dominate. So our insecure, wounded parts bump up against others' insecure, wounded parts, and we other people. We let the ways we're different grow our sense of disconnection. So when we live out of that sense of disconnection from ourselves and others and God and the earth, we're more likely to react in those hostile ways. And then we get driven by fear, ego, and the need to protect ourselves. So we engage in these defensive behaviors to avoid vulnerability and pain. And we reach for tools like hostility, and we do a lot of damage.
Enter all the isms: sexism, racism, ageism, ableism, ism.
Yeah. And then it's like a race to the bottom, right? Of retaliation, responding to hostilities in kind, on and on it goes.
Exactly. And it solidifies into structural inequalities and all kinds of not fun stuff. But hostility is not the whole story. It's not the end of our story. Just look at what Jesus does. In Ephesians chapter 4, it says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility."
And so while hostility seems to be our natural way, we can hear Jesus regularly calling for us to go beyond the natural way or our natural way.
Yeah, and by leading the way himself, right? Reconciling opposing groups. And we are then invited to join him in that ministry of reconciliation. So after the story of the fall in Genesis, the rest of the Bible is the story of us icons who have been so committed to the path of otherness, slowly taking a U-turn, slowly growing to become icons, learning the way of oneness. The Jesus path invites us to a life of being prepared for the new heaven, the new earth, a return to Eden. And that's the new world order Jesus came to announce, the kingdom of God. So we are called out of our cracked relationship of otherness into a restored relationship of oneness with God, ourselves, others, and the world.
Mm. Beautiful.
That's good. That's good stuff. You mentioned, Karla, that hostility is often rooted in fear. I'm wondering, are there ways that we can sort of invite God into those fears in a way that leads to transformation?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. In one way, working that out is a question for us individually to wrestle with on a daily basis. So I call those journey questions. It's one we just keep asking. So you can ask it in a heated moment, which is pretty challenging, or in reflection after an interaction has gone pear-shaped. We can ask, like, how can I invite God here right now to be with me in this fear? Because fear and anxiety, all those uncomfortable emotions can be so uncomfortable. We tend to act quickly to get out of the feeling. So when something triggers our protective mechanisms, we may tend to lash out. But if we can learn to wait, pause, and just leave enough space, allowing God's tenderness to meet us in that moment, there's just so much more room for different choices. We'll probably act differently. So say I'm arguing with my spouse. I don't usually feel very tender or open in the heat of the moment. But if I can actually notice what's going on, notice my hostility, and move towards the parts that are feeling hostile, let God love them, I can get to the point where I'm more receptive. And even though I'm still angry, I'm far more likely to listen, to see more possibilities, and to be able to speak on behalf of my anger and hurt rather than lashing out of my hurt. And that just leads to better outcomes. So God's compassion helps us put down the weapons we don't need, but it doesn't mean giving up on asserting ourselves, being courageous, saying things that need to be said.
Right.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes this is really helpful for me thinking through things. I'm a person, my emotions, I wear them on my sleeve. So sometimes that, moving towards God in my anger or hostility, even sadness, because it just comes, it requires a lot of work and some self-awareness. It doesn't come easy to me, but I've got a question for the both of you that's kind of haunting me a little bit. Karla, you've talked a lot about self-awareness as being a key part of the personal transformation process. And when we consider our own hostility, sorry, not hospitality, bringing a lens of curiosity to that, self-awareness to that might be a big help. And, this is something Grace and I talk a lot about on the Sacred Sofa as well, right? Giving ourselves and our listeners, time and an exhortation towards self-awareness. But I find myself skeptical sometimes of self-awareness because I just don't know if I'm tricking myself, sometimes. So are there limitations to self-awareness? And is it possible at some point we need like an external influence in our lives to push us maybe towards change and growth? Like, for instance, can we emphasize self-awareness? When we do that, is there a risk, say, of minimizing external forces, say God's work of grace or God's spirit in changing our lives? I'm just curious about that.
Karla, do you want to address those questions first? I can follow up.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good. It's such a big issue. Like, this is something that everybody struggles with. It's so tricky. We're so good at deceiving ourselves and hiding, right? And just kind of overall blindness. But self-awareness doesn't mean we have to generate it ourselves, right? We can cultivate self-awareness as we practice incorporating wisdom from the resources all around us, like other people's words or events, scripture, poetry, whatever it is. We absolutely need things external to us to interpret our limited thought patterns. So, like, my rut is to assume that I'm at fault easily. I know that others are wired the opposite way. So we have individual invitations that we need to attend to. And we really need those outside inputs. So that's why I've found tools like the Enneagram or internal family systems are really invaluable to help me see things I wouldn't otherwise notice very easily. And I have my own spiritual director, supervisor, and as I offer spiritual direction myself for others, I get to witness courage and compassion in action. And being in that place of unconditional, compassionate regard is just incredibly healing. It really is compassion that allows me to face things and allows me to become more self-aware. Otherwise, my shame would just shut everything down before I can even see what's there, right? And then receiving and reflecting on all these outside inputs is what can make them really powerful.
I very much agree, Karla, even from my own personal and professional experience. For me, self-awareness doesn't exclude community influence or external influences, or support or even exhortations, but it actually welcomes it. To grow in self-awareness, we must be rooted in safe community so we don't go rogue, right?
Yeah.
And be in self-denial. And as a therapist and fellow human, I work to create safe and protected spaces for folks. And to do that, I need to keep doing my own internal work, so my stuff doesn't crowd out the space my clients need. As a therapist, I have a clinical supervisor, and she helps me to monitor myself. And as a fellow human, I have my own personal therapist. And trust me, I am happy to take off my therapist hat and sink into that literal and figurative couch and allow her to just hold space for me and my human needs for validation, support, insight, and yes, even the ugly cries.
I hear you.
I gotta say, I think the two of you have completely alleviated my fears and concerns, my skepticism on self-awareness. I just really like the focus on community and outside. I think that just brings a really holistic understanding to self-awareness, because I think it can be easy to initially hear self-awareness as just a me, myself, and I sort of journey inside. And so hey, that was very helpful for me.
Okay. High five, Karla.
Yeah, high five,
Karla.
Yes.
We have a
it feels like we should have a party.
Conversion.
But I am converted. I'm fully converted now. But it leads me, this leads me to then a very important question, which would be, how can we create communities, or specifically in faith communities, but maybe beyond that as well? How can we create communities where people feel safe enough to let their guard down and experience true belonging, allowing other people to be part of our process, our self-awareness process?
So I'm actually going to address that in the next piece as I talk about hospitality being space. But I think a huge piece is something you've led the way on doing, just normalizing struggles, being honest and authentic about it. And that's just not as common as it needs to be. But so important. And then we as a community and as individuals, we just try to do our best to continue the good and challenging work of providing those safe spaces. So in our homes and in our hearts. So it is like I said, hospitality is all about creating space where we don't judge others, where we don't jump in to fix them, where we just trust that they will eventually hear what they need to hear.
That kind of patience, though, Karla, is quite challenging. It's very, very challenging.
It really is. I'm pretty sure I prayed just this week with the greatest of love and care for someone to get a kick in the butt if they needed it, which is not for me to say, of course, but I was just suggesting it just in case God hadn't thought of that yet.
That's real.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's just like, it's time for this realization to occur to you. But we really do actually have to loosen our grip on our opinion of what others need to do and let them work it out with God while being as present and open as we can, and make room for those questions and doubts and being human.
I want to add to your affirmation of Brad, just how vulnerable you are as a leader and how intentional you are and not shying away from those hot topics to discuss, question, explore. Like, that's super powerful. And I believe it does invite other people to be as vulnerable, or to at least start to consider being vulnerable. Right. And honestly, that's one of the many qualities I appreciate about you as my brother on this Jesus path together. So I just really want to affirm you. And you too, Karla. I also appreciate your vulnerability and your wisdom. And it's been great to have you again, sharing your insights with us and the listeners here on the Sacred Sofa. Thanks for being here.
So glad to be. Thank you both.
Yeah, I thank you for all the kindness. I'm not sure if it's because you converted me and now you're being all nice. No, that was a really actually insightful and helpful discussion for me, and I learned lots, as I always do, from the both of you. So on that note, okay, so we've covered one side of the coin. Next week, Karla, we're heading to hospitality. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
All right.
Have a look at what that means.
Awesome. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, Karla and Grace, again for your wisdom and insights, and we'll see everyone next time.
All right. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.